with our Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose, who's standing by in the West Bank here now. Emily, can you give us an idea of just what's planned today by the Palestinians or what's already taking place?
Well, actually, David, I'm just really going to show you. I'll move aside so our cameraman, Oren, can take you to the scene that's manifesting behind me. And what you're seeing is, as you mentioned, a product of that day of rage. Now, we know from Palestinian officials that they've called for a recess on schools and universities at this time between the hours of 11:30 and 1 o'clock. So that's just right now. And we could probably see behind us what I've been told by locals is hundreds of protesters coming out to this protest, this part of the protest alone. And as you mentioned, they're expressing their rage. We're seeing here crowd dispersal methods being used by the local Israeli security forces. They're using tear gas to disperse the crowds. We can taste it in the air. Actually, it's making us tear up here on this border, as well as the security services around us, because it's really getting very much into the air. And you can see also tire fires there. That's a product of protests that we see, a tactic used in a lot of the protests here in this area, a sign, as you mentioned, as the day of rage. And really the impetus for these protests was a statement by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last week that the settlements here in the West Bank, the Jewish settlements, might not exactly contradict the clauses of international law. That's something that's very contested by Palestinian leaders and the Palestinian residents here. They say that it does mark an infraction and a contest of international law, that it doesn't go with the Geneva Convention, and that those settlements do comprise a violation of international law. Israel, of course, says that this land is disputed and was conquered, was taken in 1967 in a defensive war, and thus does not comprise a violation of international law. So two different perspectives there, but what you can see behind me is a manifestation of that rage, and Palestinian leaders have been calling to come out here and march. And you can see just in front of me the protesters here are trying to push back, but they're also dispersing quite a bit because they also can taste this tear gas in the air, and they're moving further away from where the Israeli military is, in fact, trying to disperse those crowds.
That really leads me to my next question here. You mentioned the schools being closed. We know that school children typically play a large role in such confrontations with the IDF. Have you seen signs yet of just how the army is preparing to deal with such a confrontation?
Well, certainly the Israeli military here is on high alert, and we're hearing some shots behind me. That's likely the use of tear gas canisters. So I'm just going to step aside again so you can see what's manifesting. But yes, the Israeli military here is on high alert. We saw them bolstering the troops at a lot of different checkpoints. And I have to mention here that Palestinian leadership was saying to the protesters in advance of this to try to avoid places where the Israeli military would stand. So that would ordinarily be Israeli military checkpoints, and to actually try to avoid those spots of friction. But as you can see in front of me, that evasive tactic didn't work. We're seeing here direct clashes, in fact, between Israeli security forces and these protesters who are coming up to this checkpoint. We're standing directly at an Israeli military checkpoint, so you can see that they are approaching, they are advancing, but they are advancing and then moving backwards due to these crowd dispersal methods, which, as I mentioned, is that tear gas that we can taste in the air and we can see right in front of us. So perhaps friction unavoided. Still, this continues. And you can see that just in front of me, the Israeli military is sort of trying to advance, but also, again, using that tear gas to try to keep these protesters at bay and keep them away from those checkpoints by using that tear gas as a tactic to try to push them backwards.
Well, Emily, it's a great shot you've brought us here. I mean, it's a battle truly unfolding here just behind you there that you brought us here. Have we heard any threats from, say, Hamas or the Islamic Jihad or one of the more heavily armed groups?
Well, mostly this was an organization by the factions in the West Bank, and that's probably likely because this was a statement made about the West Bank. And just to give you an indication here, many took umbrage at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's statement earlier in the election campaign, in the last election campaign, that Israel would assert authority over the Jordan Valley and try to annex parts of the West Bank as well. So that is really the point of contention here, and it really would have actual live implications on the ground for these Palestinians that you see behind me. And for the Palestinians in the West Bank, because as we know here, those settlements are a contested issue for these residents here. So that's really the main issue for them. And it really was, we saw Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian Authority here in the West Bank making those calls. And I saw myself members of those factions, again, as I mentioned, try to call for some kind of a lack of confrontation or avoid confrontation directly with Israeli military. But as you can see behind me, perhaps that didn't exactly go according to plan.
Well, as usual, our Middle East correspondent Emily Rose taking us right to where the